This is a visual history of Coldstream Mill that lies near Beith in North Ayrshire. The photographs were taken in 1998. However, the mill ceased to function in 1991 when Andrew Smith, the last miller, retired. This means that this mill was probably the last traditional mill working in Ayrshire and probably also in Scotland at the time. Coldstream Mill is now a private dwelling. It's first shown on an early 17th century map where it is noted as Whitestone Mill. It seems its official name was Whitestone Mill in the lands of Coldstream. The mill seems to be linked to the Montgomery family of the Hessilhead estate. The Montgomery family were closely related to the Earls of Eglinton. A variety of millers are recorded over the ages. One of the last had cousins who also were involved with Cunningham Head Mill and Pierston Mill. The mill received its water, which it used to power the water wheel, from the Whitestone burn that ran directly into the old mill pond. But most of the water came from the Dusk water. This was diverted by a primitive little dam, which diverted water down into the mill pond. There are two flagstones close to the Dusk water itself, and when the water reached there, that was sufficient water for one day's milling. The mill shows signs of having been expanded and enlarged on several occasions. At the end, it had 3 pairs of millstones. The water wheel was cast iron. It doesn't carry a maker's name, and there's a clear point where there's been a break that's been repaired. The mill would turn at roughly 6 revolutions per minute. The wheel was an overshot wheel, with the water coming from the top. The wall behind it, known as the splash wall, is the best constructed in the mill. Because of the constant action of water against it, had to be very well built. Also, usually there's a group of trees that would provide shade for the wheel. During the summer, when it wasn't working, there was a danger that the wood within the actual wheel itself would warp, despite the fact it had an outside construction of cast iron. The mill was probably a corn mill, producing flour for baking and so on, but later became a mill for producing animal feed. Linseed cake, beans, maize and barley were brought in by cart from Lugton Station. The water supply seemed to be very reliable. The mill never had any auxiliary power. There was never any oil engines, diesel engines, or steam engines associated with it. Also, it never had electricity supply. Though the mill had 3 pairs of millstones, it seemed to be working on a 3-week cycle, whereby 2 of the millstones will always be operational, whilst 1 will be being dressed, that is, prepared with the cuts made on its surface for the milling of whatever type of grain was going to be passed through it. The mill pond was a considerable size. It had to be drained and cleaned out annually. The sluice case operations can clearly be seen, and the walls of the dam itself had a clay core. One of the last additions to the mill seemed to be a large corrugated iron shed. Before that, there seems to have been a kiln built. The kiln building was a long rectangular building which had an iron grill from which the grain was dried, with the fire coming from below. The access below was through a doorway. When the mill was finally closed, the area below was filled to a great depth with the husks from the grain that had been dried. The roof of the kiln had a long air vent running along its length. This was to allow the escape of the air, the moist air from the grain below. Ground floor was where the main gears being driven off the water wheel were present. The first floor had the millstones, and the second floor was where the hoppers, where the grain was passed into it to flow down into the millstones, were present. There was a sack hoist driven off the wheel that brought sacks from the ground floor right the way up to the top floor to be poured into the hoppers. One interesting aspect of the gearing being driven off the water wheel is that though they were mainly cast iron, the actual teeth were made of wood. This was because they were sacrificial. That is, if suddenly something stopped the main wheel from turning, if it was cast iron, then the teeth would break. That would be very expensive, difficult to replace. The sort of wood used had to be very hard, such as hornbeam, and it's interesting that hornbeam trees still grow in the area, although they're normally very rare in the countryside. Reference was made to the dressing of the millstones. This had to be done with chisels. The chisel had to be exceedingly hard. There was a story told of how the chisels were sent down to the blacksmith at Gateside. There was a new blacksmith, and he did his best, but they were not hard enough, and he had to have a second attempt at them. Many alterations were made to the mill over the years. Much of the mill has got cement render and lime wash. Here and there's got corrugated iron rather than slates over the buildings. And originally, it seems that the carts carrying the grain to be ground were brought down to near the water wheel. The access there eventually was blocked up. Awkward height to bring the vehicles down, and when the kiln was built, it was no longer necessary. At some point, a couple of seed crushers or bruisers were brought in. These were driven from the water wheel using belt drives. Scotland did have a source of millstones. Nearby Fairley was one example. But the stones at the Coldstream Mill are French burr, and they're compound. That is, sections of stone brought over from France, then fitted around a central core with an iron hoop around the outside. Photographs clearly show the shaker or tickler. This was a device whereby the grain was sprinkled onto the stones. The distance between the two millstones was critical, and this had to be very carefully set. The most crucial part of the mill was the rind, that is, a three-spoked cast iron device that slotted into the wheel that turned. This was often found on millers' gravestones as a symbol of their profession. Coldstream Mill started off life as the Barony Mill. That is, all the tenants living within a particular barony were forced to use the local mill. Once the law was changed, however, the tenants were free to choose. This meant that many small mills were abandoned, whilst others prospered, and Coldstream had been one of these. Sadly, Coldstream is no longer a working mill. Rather close by is Dalgarvan Mill, which is a museum of country life and costume. In fact, some of the items from Coldstream were donated to the museum.